Well, good morning. Greetings from Twin Rivers Park. Oh, no, I said it wrong again. It's Two Rivers Park in Portland, Michigan. And I got to remember to turn on my microphone. That'll help amplify my voice a little bit. And we had the opportunity last time to gather here and talk about a significant personality in the Bible called Nicodemus. I abbreviated his name to Nick because that's just what we do as Americans. We like our shortened names. And we looked at an insider's point of view of what Jesus was to him and what his religion was to him. And we ultimately decided by the end of the message that you could have the right religious system and you could do all the right things that system demands, but still walk away feeling unfulfilled. And what he really needed to do was have a relationship with Jesus. And what we found out was that there could be 18 inches between heaven and hell. So I like to illustrate that with a ruler. You just hold up a ruler, and between your brain and your heart is 18 inches. So you can know a lot about God, but if you don't have God in your heart, you're not going to heaven. And we decided by the end of the message that it wasn't really about getting to heaven, about getting a person into heaven. It was more about getting God into a person. Well, today we have a completely different kind of person. So the story evolves a different kind of way. So we're going to look at that and do a little comparison between Nick and a person I'm going to end up naming Benjamin, because he doesn't actually have a name in the story. And this story will come out of John chapter 9. Now, a lot of people will do anything they can to be free from being blind. I can't really empathize with that. I've never been blind in my life. But I can understand the urgent desire to want to see, especially if you start losing your sight at some point later in life. Well, I caught this story of strange stories on a TV channel, and it talked about a guy going through a process called osteo odonto keratoprothesis. It's basically an eye and a tooth. They can now take a part of your tooth and jawbone and sew it into a flap of skin under the eye, let living cells grow around it so that they can later transplant that tooth into your eye, put a lens cylinder in it, and that becomes your new eye. I'd never heard of such a thing before in my life. But it's both the marvels of man to be able to develop a scientific technique like that. They somehow figured out that the body would not reject a tooth put in your eye socket, whereas it might reject something else that's artificial. And this procedure worked. Now, the particular man in Great Britain that had gotten the procedure didn't see immediately. So he's like, I think this failed utterly. But it didn't. It just took a while for the brain to start to recognize these images and interpret them as being legit. And now we can see again through that eye. So I thought, well, that's amazing. And it was also amazing because this person out of Great Britain, when the doctor first told him what he wanted to do, he's like, you're crazy. But this man was so desperate to see his children again that he was willing to go through this complicated and not, by the way, guaranteed procedure to regain his sight. Well, this takes us to the story in John chapter 9. Gospel according to John chapter 9. We have a blind man. And what's interesting about the story is when the disciples see this blind man, blind from birth, sitting at the street corner begging, they start out with a question. The disciples asked Jesus, Master, who was born blind, this man or his parents? Or who had sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus says, well, it wasn't an issue of who sinned first, but this was done so that the works of God might be displayed in this man's life. And Jesus walks up to the man. He spits into the ground, makes some clay out of his spittle, puts it on the man's eyes, and tells him to go wash the clay out in this certain pool. So this man goes, he washes it out, and he can see again. So everybody in the community knows this man was born blind. And they're like, hey, how did this happen? And he says, well, this man told me to put this clay on my eyes and wash it out, and now I can see. Well, news gets around, because this is a miracle, obviously. And the religious leaders of the day get word of it. Now, there's another layer of complication here culturally, in that the Jews of the day decided if you had some kind of physical malady, a physical handicap, that meant that you were not blessed by God. And some even took it a step further and said, you must be cursed by God. Something must be wrong in your family. And that's why the disciples asked the original theological question. They looked at the man, and what they saw was a theological issue that they wanted Jesus to address on a technical level, on an intellectual level. And Jesus turned the issue into saying, no, this is a person. This is a person who all his life has been blind, and he has not been able to see. And I'm going to act in compassion and give him sight. Now, you would think the community would be all happy and rejoicing at this man's good fortune. But when the word reaches these religious leaders, they look at Jesus and, well, they don't know who it is at first. They question the blind man who can now see. And he says, I don't know who it was. And they call in the parents of the blind man, Benjamin. And Benjamin's parents say, we don't know. We weren't there. He's of age. Ask him. And then the scripture says, they said this because they were afraid of the religious leaders. They're basically saying, he's of age to testify in a court of law. Ask him. Don't ask us. We don't want to get involved. So they are like the Pharisees in a sense, that they see this man as a problem. The Pharisees see him as a problem because they find out Jesus healed on the Sabbath. So there's a theological issue. You're breaking the law. You can't do this. We don't do this kind of work on the Sabbath. And the parents see their own son as a problem because if they side with their son publicly, the leader of the synagogue can kick them out. Now, synagogues are a little different than modern day churches in that if we get our pastor upset at us, he's not going to tell the local butcher, don't sell meat to this person. He's not going to tell the local grocery store owner not to sell bread to us. But in these tight-knit communities, there were serious repercussions if the synagogue leader kicked you out. It wasn't just that you get the stigma, but it actually affected you being able to do business in the Jewish community. And you definitely didn't want to go with the Gentiles because they weren't going to be nice to you at all, just because you're a Jew. So the parents are calculating all this and saying, we're going to let this young man handle this situation on his own and whatever the consequences are. So the religious leaders come up to this young man, and I just like his gumption because he's like, well, I don't know who this man was, but what I do know is I was blind and now I see. Simple statement of the obvious. And when they find out it's Jesus, they say, well, we don't think this can be right because this man is healing on the Sabbath. That makes him a sinner. God doesn't listen to sinners. Surely this can't be right. And they press this man to tell a different version of the story. And he says, I can only tell you what I know to be true. Whether this man is a sinner or not, I don't know. I just know that I was blind and now I see. And he gets back to them and says, now, is it that you want to be a disciple also, that you keep bringing up this subject? And they get mad. They feel he's impertinent, disrespectful, and they cast him out of the synagogue. So we don't know where this young man is in his faith walk. I imagine him to be somewhere between 20 and 35, is how I always portray him in my mind. We're not told his age. We're not told his name. But that's where I figure he's at. And he's got this huge change in his life, and he's got to decide how he's going to process it and what he's going to do. Well, Jesus catches up with him. And Jesus says, I'm the one who did this, and do you believe in me? And the young man says, yes, I do. I worship you, because I know that only a man of God could have done this thing. So this man goes through this whole process of society labeling him as an outcast. You've been born blind. Who are you? He's cast off to the side. He's got to earn his living by begging, most demeaning form getting by. And Jesus now comes to him and gives him dignity. Not only does he heal his sight, but he gives him the ability now to enter the workforce and earn his way in life. And a lot of times we tend to label people. We label them as someone limited or not right, or they really don't belong. We kind of push them out. And I got to thinking about churches a lot of times being such a close-knit community. And it really struck me one day. I had taken someone to church, and I said, afterwards we ate at a restaurant, and I said, well, what did you think about that experience? And he said, honestly, it felt like I was coming to someone else's family reunion. I thought, wow, is that the message we're giving out when we show up and we visit a church and we're just treated like some outsider passing through? And I got a problem with that. I got a problem with churches being so focused on us being a family that no one else really feels that they can come in and be part of that family. Some churches have events and they don't even bother telling people where the events is because it's always been at that place every year. So we don't need to tell you. If you're on the inside track, you already know. So we've got some issues there in our church that we need to work on. And I think of a certain individual in my life who has a neck ailment. Her neck is so twisted and leaned over from a car accident that her spine now is just totally misaligned. And the doctors can't figure it out. The complication for her, more than just a physical, is that she's in a certain Christian movement where healing is major. This is what they specialize in. They've got faith to be healed. They really believe God can heal. And she said, it's so frustrating for me to go. She's a wife of a pastor. It's so frustrating for me to go to our annual meetings and I'm not healed. I just feel that people are looking at me saying, oh dear, if you just had enough faith. That's how she feels. And Jesus would have an issue with that, I think. Sometimes things happen in our life so that the work of God can be displayed. Now, I have faith. I pray for this young lady every time I see her picture on Facebook because it's so obvious what her physical ailment is. And I can empathize with a neck issue. I know what that's like to feel so limited in that respect. So my heart goes out for her all the time. And I'm always praying. And I know I have faith for healing. The Lord has healed me to a huge degree of my own affliction. So I'm pretty sure it's not a faith issue. And sometimes we don't always understand when God brings his grace into our life and when he withholds it. But we have the confidence in the nature of his character. But back to our young man in the story, who I'm calling Benjamin, in the Gospel of John, chapter 9. He's a blind man. And we got these leaders of the church synagogue and religious leaders having an issue with Jesus. And Jesus says, bring it back to compassion. Do you help some donkey that falls into the ditch on a Sunday? Or on your Sabbath? Back then it was a Saturday. Well, of course you do. You help out. And that's all I'm doing here. I'm helping out. And this man, unlike Nicodemus, didn't come to Jesus for help. He's not the Bartimaeus of Mark chapter 10, who sees Jesus, well, he's blind, so he doesn't see Jesus coming down the road, but he knows Jesus is coming, and he says, Jesus, Son of Man, have mercy on me. He really asks for it. He's very persistent. And the crowd tries to quiet him. This is Bartimaeus. And Jesus says, what do you want? I want to be healed. Well, this man in John chapter 9 isn't that individual. He doesn't know Jesus is there. He doesn't ask Jesus for anything. Jesus goes to him. And Jesus offers him sight. And he offers himself to the man. So a lot of times we're operating in a world where people don't think they're worthy of knowing God. They know their depravity. They know their rebellious nature. They feel they've gone too far. And I guess that message is really for that individual today. Because I'm thinking of a hymn, Amazing Grace, written by John Newton. And he says, I was blind and now I see. And everybody says he got that verse from this story in the Gospel of John. Well, John Newton, you probably have heard about him. And he was the same time period of John Wesley, a super religious guy in the Methodist faith. And in contrast, John Newton was just a total opposite of anything religious. He was irreligious, he was blasphemous, and, sailors at the time really were rough, rude, and crude. They would come up with baldy stories and just find new ways to insult people and invent curse words. Well, John Newton was the master of inventing new curse words that nobody had thought of yet. He was particularly artful in insulting his captains. He disrespected anyone in authority. Well, he got involved in sailing at the time, and as he was going back and forth, a lot of storms would come up, and he would always cry out to God for mercy in these storms. But then, when things calmed down, he was safe. He totally forgot all the promises he made to God during those crisis situations. But one time, he decided to get right with God. Now, his mother, her original plan was for him to be a preacher. And part of it was him just totally rebelling against all that. But he does come around, and he actually meets up with John Wesley. And John Wesley says, you need to become a preacher. And John Newton does. Who saved a wretch like me. I was utterly lost, totally depraved. God couldn't want me, and yet God met with him. So whether you're an insider like Nicodemus, and you're doing all the right things and you still aren't right with God, or whether you're a John Newton and you're doing all the wrong things, you can be right with God. And that's the truth and the hope of the nature of our God. He sees the person. He doesn't see the label, blind man. He doesn't see the label, outcast. He doesn't see the label, problem. He sees the person every time. And he wants to meet with that person every time. Now, how does he do that? Well, Jesus doesn't walk the earth in bodily form anymore. He doesn't engage people in conversations anymore. He doesn't spit into the ground and make clay and say, oh, you're blind? Here, let me put this in your eyes. Which, by the way, sounds like a worse medical procedure than making an eye and a tooth. But it worked, because he's Jesus. Well, how does he work today? He works through us. And a lot of the reasons I preach in a part publicly, because I'm hoping somebody will come by and say, I would have never stepped into a door of a church to meet with this God. But since you're here in this park and you're saying you know Jesus, and I know I need Jesus, talk to me. And I'm always here preaching publicly, waiting for that divine opportunity. And you may have an appointment. You may be watching this on Facebook right now and saying, I need to have that appointment with Jesus. Well, we can help you with that. I've got my email here on this page. Just email me and we'll make that connection. God wants to connect with you today. Are you willing to have that relationship? Thank you for coming today, and God bless.